Picture this. It's a scorching summer afternoon in the Aussie suburbs. The air is thick with the smell of sizzling sausages on the barbie, the distant roar of a lawnmower, and the faint sound of cricket commentary drifting from a radio. And what's sitting proudly in the driveway, baking in the sun? A Holden. Maybe it's a dusty Kingswood wagon loaded up for a family trip. Maybe it's a gleaming Monaro, its V8 engine rumbling with quiet promise. Or maybe it's the family Commodore, the workhorse that's seen more school runs, grocery trips, and holiday drives than anyone can count. For nearly 70 years, that image was the wallpaper of Australian life. Holden became a powerful symbol of what Australia could build with its own two hands. You drove a Holden because it felt like home on wheels, a piece of the nation's soul you could own. The brand was stitched into the fabric of our identity, as fundamental as the footy, meat pies, and kangaroos. The death of Holden, therefore, tore a hole in the heart of the nation. Its closure marked the end of an era and exposed the quiet, creeping collapse of Australian manufacturing as a whole. It's a chronicle of economic theories, political blunders, and global forces that dismantled an entire industry brick by brick until nothing was left but memories and a handful of classic cars in museums. To understand how Australia went from building its own future to importing nearly everything, you need to understand the rise and the heartbreaking fall of the once mighty Holden. To find the roots of this Australian icon, you have to go way back, long before cars even existed. The year is 1856 in Adelaide, South Australia. A 21-year-old English immigrant named James Alexander Holden sets up a business, Holden and Frost, a saddlery and leather goods company. For decades, they were masters of horsepower of the original kind, building the saddles and harnesses that powered the Australian colony. As the world changed though, so did Holden. When the first noisy, spluttering automobiles arrived, the company saw the future. They pivoted from saddles to upholstery, then to repairing car bodies. After World War I, they hit the big time, becoming one of the premier coach builders in the country, crafting beautiful custom bodies for imported chassis from companies like Chevrolet and Dodge. In 1931, the American giant General Motors saw the potential and bought the company, creating General Motors Holdens Limited. But the true magic, the moment Holden became a household name, came after the smoke cleared from World War II. Imagine Australia in 1945. The war was over, the threat of invasion was gone, and there was a collective sigh of relief. The nation was tired but optimistic, yearning for a brighter, more prosperous future. It was a time to build, to create, to define what Australia could be on its own terms. The government, led by Prime Minister Ben Chifley, had a bold vision. A country as vast and isolated as Australia needed its own car, viewing it as a critical piece of national security, industrial strength, and post-war pride. On November 29th, 1948, the first ever mass-produced all-Australian car rolled off the assembly line at Fisherman's Bend in Victoria. The Holden 48-215, affectionately known forever as the FX. The FX was built for Australia by Australians. Its engineering was brilliantly simple, which proved to be its greatest strength. The 2.15-litre grey motor was under-stressed and over-engineered, earning a legendary reputation for being absolutely bulletproof. It was tough enough to handle corrugated country roads that would shatter other vehicles, simple enough for any backyard mechanic with a basic set of tools to fix, and it had just enough ground clearance to navigate a farm track. Crucially, it was affordable. For the first time, the dream of car ownership was within reach for the average working family. The public went absolutely wild. There was a waiting list thousands of people long. Owning a Holden FX was a status symbol of patriotism and progress, a declaration that Australia had arrived. The success was immediate and overwhelming. Its successor, the facelifted FJ Holden of 1953, became even more iconic with its famous toothy grille. The FJ truly became the face of 1950s Australia, a rolling emblem of optimism and prosperity. For much of the 50s and 60s, Holden dominated the sales charts, with 1 in every 2 cars sold in Australia bearing its badge. The decades that followed were a golden age. Holden's designers and engineers were crafting legends that perfectly captured the spirit of the times. There was the Holden Utes, a uniquely Australian invention. Part car, part truck, the coupe utility was the ultimate work and play vehicle. It could haul hail bays on the farm during the week and then get cleaned up to take the family to church on Sunday. For generations of farmers and tradies, the Holden Ute was an essential and beloved part of their identity. The Holden Kingswood, launched in 1968, became the quintessential Australian family car. It was the chariot for 1 million family road trips, the car you learned to drive in, the car that took you to the beach, the car that was always there. It was so deeply embedded in our culture that comedian Paul Hogan's catchphrase, "Get out of the Kingswood," became a national inside joke. Holden also had a wild side. In that same year, 1968, they unleashed the Monaro, a sleek, 2-door muscle car that was pure sex appeal on wheels. The Monaro was Australia's answer to the Ford Mustang and became an instant classic, winning the legendary Bathurst 500 endurance race in its very first year. Then, in the 70s, Holden tapped into the youth culture with one of its most controversial and beloved vehicles of all time, the Holden Sandman. It was a panel van marketed as a lifestyle accessory. With a mattress in the back, custom decals on the side, and a V8 up front, the Sandman became the official vehicle of sun, surf, and freedom. Nicknamed the Shag and Wagon and the Sin Bin, it was a rolling symbol of rebellion and youthful exuberance that sent parents into a moral panic. This cultural dominance was powered by a massive industrial engine. At its peak, Holden directly employed tens of thousands of people in sprawling factories in Elizabeth, South Australia, and Fisherman's Bend, Victoria. For thousands, working at Holden was a lifelong career. It was a place where generations of the same family worked side by side. These were good, secure, unionized jobs that built Australia's middle class, paying for mortgages, putting kids through school, and powering local economies. Holden was the beating heart of entire communities. Australia made things, real things you could touch and be proud of, with Holden as the proudest example. But this golden age couldn't last forever. The world was changing and a storm was gathering on the horizon. Starting in the 1980s, the economic philosophy that had built Australia began to shift. The new buzzwords were deregulation, free trade, and globalisation. The idea, pushed by both sides of politics, was to tear down the protective walls around the Australian economy and force local industries to compete on a global scale. Tariffs, taxes on imported goods that made local cars cheaper, were slashed. They dropped from a high of 57.5% in the mid-80s down to 15% by 2000 and eventually to just 5%. Suddenly, Holden was in a street fight with the entire world. The first wave came from Japan. Small, incredibly reliable, and fuel-efficient cars from Toyota flooded the market just as the 1970s oil crisis made Aussies think twice about their big, thirsty V8s. Then came the Koreans in the 90s, with Hyundai and Kia offering incredible value for money. Finally, our free trade agreement with Thailand in the 2000s opened the floodgates for a tsunami of cheap, Thai-built utes and SUVs. Holden was now competing against factories in countries with far lower wages and massive economies of scale. It was a fight with one hand tied behind its back. The government solution was a complex scheme called the Button Car Plan, named after Senator John Button. It aimed to make the local industry more efficient by reducing the number of models being built and encouraging car makers to share parts and platforms. This led to one of the weirdest periods in Australian car history, the era of badge engineering. Suddenly, a Holden dealership was selling a Holden Nova, which was a rebadged Toyota Corolla, while the Holden Apollo was a Toyota Camry. This might have made sense on an economist's spreadsheet, but it confused customers and diluted the very thing that made Holden special. But despite the mounting pressures, Holden wasn't going down without a fight. In the early 2000s, they made one last monumental gamble. They invested over $1 billion to design and engineer an entirely new car from the ground up, right here in Australia. The result was the 2006 VE Commodore, and it was magnificent. The VE was a world-class vehicle. It looked incredible, it drove beautifully, and it was praised by critics around the globe. It was so good that it was exported to the United States as the Pontiac G8 and later the Chevrolet SS, becoming a cult classic. This car was proof that Australia still had the talent, the skill, and the ambition to build cars with the best of them. But it was the right car at the exact wrong time. Just as the VE Commodore hit its stride, the 2008 global financial crisis ravaged the world economy. Credit dried up, confidence plummeted, and fuel prices went through the roof. At the same time, its parent company, General Motors, was collapsing, filing for bankruptcy in the US. The fallout was brutal. Decisions were no longer being made in Melbourne, they were being dictated from a crisis room in Detroit. GM's new global strategy was all about efficiency and using the same car designs everywhere. This created a big problem for cars needing the steering wheel on the right. For a global company like GM, the handful of countries that drive on the left side of the road, including Australia, was simply too small a market to justify the huge cost of engineering separate vehicles. As a result, Holden lost its autonomy and the Australian design and engineering teams were gutted. The Commodore, the heart and soul of the brand, was living on borrowed time. The political climate in Australia had also turned frosty. The debate shifted from how to support the industry to whether it should be supported at all. The government's Economic Advisory Board, the Productivity Commission, released a series of influential reports arguing that automotive subsidies were inefficient and holding back the economy. This provided the intellectual firepower for those in politics who wanted to end the support. In 2013, the newly elected coalition government, led by Prime Minister Tony Abbott, took a hard line. Treasurer Joe Hockey famously dared GM to justify its existence, declaring in Parliament that the era of handouts was over. Faced with an ultimatum and no guarantee of future government support, GM made the call. On December 11th, 2013, the news broke like a national tragedy. General Motors announced it would end all car manufacturing in Australia by 2017. The Elizabeth plant would be closed, and the Australian-made car was officially dead. After nearly 70 years, the production lines were going silent. The final 4 years were a long, painful funeral procession. On October 20th, 2017, the last car, a red Commodore SSV Redline, rolled off the Elizabeth assembly line, flanked by emotional workers, many of whom had spent their entire lives in that factory. It was a heartbreaking end to the Australian dream. But GM wasn't done yet. They had promised that Holden would live on as a brand, importing and selling rebadged cars from other GM factories around the world. Dealerships invested millions in showroom upgrades, and loyal customers held on to a sliver of hope. That hope was crushed on February 17, 2020. In a cold corporate announcement, GM declared they were killing the Holden brand entirely. The impact was immediate and devastating. The closure of Holden vaporized thousands of direct and indirect jobs. Entire supply chains that had been built over generations collapsed overnight. Highly skilled toolmakers, engineers, and manufacturing specialists were left scrambling for work. For communities like Elizabeth, it was an economic apocalypse. The heart of the town was ripped out, leaving behind a vacuum of unemployment and uncertainty. The promise from politicians was that a new, agile, tech-focused economy would rise from the ashes. We were told the displaced workers would be retrained for the jobs of the future. For many, that promise rang hollow. A 55-year-old assembly line worker couldn't just become a coder overnight. Many ended up in lower-paying, less secure work in transport, logistics, or the gig economy. The secure, middle-class life that manufacturing had provided was gone. The loss also triggered a brain drain of epic proportions. Australia's automotive designers and engineers were among the best in the world, experts in their craft who had honed their skills at Holden. With the industry gone, they had a choice: change careers or leave the country. Many of the brightest minds were forced to move to Detroit, Europe, or Asia to continue their work, taking their priceless knowledge and experience with them. Australia lost a whole generation of industrial capability. For Holden owners, the death of the brand was a kick in the guts. Resale values plummeted, parts and servicing became a source of anxiety. Class action lawsuits emerged over defects in some of the final imported models, tarnishing the brand's legacy. A company that once sold pride and loyalty now left behind headaches and a sense of abandonment. As the car industry around the world came under pressure, different countries decided to handle the problem in very different ways. In places like Germany, the government kept supporting its car makers, looking after the thousands of smaller, family-owned engineering companies that supplied the parts. In South Korea, the government had been helping brands like Hyundai and Kia for decades, determined to make them world leaders. And in America, when the 2008 financial crisis threatened to wipe out their car industry, the government stepped in with a massive bailout to save it. These countries decided that being able to build cars was too important to lose. But in Australia, a different idea took hold. For years, the thinking from government advisors was that Australia should stop trying to do everything and just stick to what it was naturally good at, like mining and farming. From this point of view, spending billions in taxpayer money to prop up car factories didn't make sense anymore. The argument was that the money was being wasted on an industry that couldn't compete, and that without the subsidies, Australians would get access to cheaper and better cars from overseas. And that's exactly what happened. The decision to end the support led to the shutdown of the entire local car industry. The biggest upside was for car buyers, who suddenly had more choice and lower prices than ever before. But there was a major downside. Australia became one of the only developed countries in the world that couldn't build its own cars. The skills needed to design, engineer, and mass-produce complex machines started to disappear. The shutdown also wiped out hundreds of smaller, local businesses that made everything from car seats to electronics. Today, the factories are quiet. The roar of V8s at Bathurst has faded, replaced by the sound of imported cars. An entire generation of Aussies will now grow up having never seen a car built in their country. The Holden line is gone, but the questions it left behind are bigger than ever, forcing Australia to think hard about what it values and what kind of country it wants to be in the years to come. But what do you think? Was letting the car industry die a massive mistake for Australia, or an inevitable, even necessary part of economic progress? Should a country protect an industry for the sake of jobs and national pride, even if it cost billions? Or is it smarter to fully embrace globalisation and let the market decide? And what's the big lesson from the Holden story? In a world of fragile supply chains, is it time for Australia to seriously think about making things again? Drop your thoughts, your favorite Holden memories, or your hot takes on the Australian industry in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories about the Lion brand. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next breakdown. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.